Welcome to week number 7. And this week we are going to focus primarily on unions and the process of collective bargaining. So, a few definitions to get us started. What is collective bargaining? Collective bargaining is a method where workers organize, usually in unions, to meet, converse, and negotiate upon work conditions with their employers, resulting in a written contract setting forth compensation, hours, and other conditions to be observed through that stipulated period. So, the result of the collective bargaining process is obviously going to be that collective bargaining agreement. That collective bargaining agreement will then be in place for a stipulated period, a limited amount of time. It may be a collective bargaining agreement that's in place for 2 years or 3 years. Oftentimes, even if we have a multi-year collective bargaining agreement, there may be the provision of what are called reopeners, whereby you can have a reopener, for instance, on salary increases. So even though you might be in a 3-year contract, you may have a salary reopener after 1 year or after 2 years, which then allows you to go back in and negotiate over that narrow issue of compensation. Traditional collective bargaining tends to be a very adversarial type of situation where it pits management against employees, those employees in that bargaining unit. And it tends to be kind of that zero-sum type of game approach, whereby in this adversarial relationship, one side wins and one side loses. That obviously makes it very difficult to come to a negotiated agreement that both sides can agree upon. And so we've tried to shift away from the adversarial bargaining to more of a cooperative, interest based bargaining approach, whereby we strive for mutual understanding and common education on the part of both labor as well as management. We are looking for issues that can be resolved for the benefit of both management as well as for employees. And it's much more this cooperative type of bargaining where we're trying to create something new. We're trying to synthesize our issues into a new approach that can be beneficial to both management as well as employees. Now, some more definitions are important for collective bargaining. The right to work states. Some states are right to work states where mandatory union membership is outlawed. You cannot be required to be in a union by virtue of the job that you have. States can have what are called meet and confer rights. And a meet and confer is a law that requires the agency heads to discuss grievances that are filed by the union. Typically, meet and confer tends to happen if there is a perceived change in work conditions. And so if management changes the work conditions of employees within that bargaining unit, then they can ask for a meet and confer where they can then sit down face to face with management and talk about those work conditions. Sometimes that comes from a grievance, but you're usually not settling grievances in meet and confer, but instead you're trying to work out a more informal type of arrangement to try and mitigate those concerns about work conditions. In the district that I used to be on the board of, I was on the board during the middle of COVID. And COVID certainly did change the work conditions of teachers because it moved teachers online and remote learning for a long period of time. And so, therefore, we had some meet and confers over those changing work conditions. Work stoppage. So, if the collective bargaining agreement expires and there's no successor agreement, then a work stoppage would be an interruption of work by the employees for the purpose of improving work conditions or placing pressure on managers in order to come to an agreement on a new collective bargaining agreement. Now, labor unions are looked upon both favorably as well as unfavorably for a variety of reasons. The favorable opinions of labor unions would view them as being champions of workplace reform, that labor unions have made workplaces safer for employees. They're champions of seeking redress against arbitrary and capricious actions against employees by employers to try and protect employees from these arbitrary, capricious, and prejudicial types of behaviors on the part of employers. Collective action often can also lead to results unattainable through individual efforts. So by working together in a collective, we're able to get these better benefits than we would be able to get as individual employees. On the flip side of that, the unfavorable opinions, payment of union dues. There was a very famous case in 2018 that you're probably familiar with, the Janus case, that looked at the issue of labor unions using the dues that they receive not just from members, but using the dues they received in terms of what we call fair share from non-members, and using those monies for political types of activities, and perhaps political activities that members of the union or even non-members would disagree with. And so we do have a limitation on the ability of unions to charge fair share dues for non-members that they are also representing. Distaste at union protection of non-productive workers, the concern that unions will protect workers who are not doing their jobs. And unions are oftentimes seen as complicating or delaying the implementation of policies by meeting and conferring and by grieving a lot of the changes that would be needed in order to implement changed policies. There is this free rider dynamic that's always been an issue with unions, in that workers may benefit from union-sponsored initiatives without joining the union. And so you don't have to be a member of the union in order to be covered by that collective bargaining agreement that is negotiated by the union. Anytime you have that free rider problem, it can be problematic because you have people who are getting benefits who are not paying the cost. Overall, union membership has been on the decline. You can see the numbers there on the screen for you. In terms of the nation's workforce, it's been cut in half since 1983. Public sector union membership has not dropped as much as union membership in the public sector, and over a third of public sector employees are still members of public sector unions, which is compared to only 6.5% of their private sector counterparts. What we are watching now, post 2018, is what type of negative impact the Janus case will have on union membership. And it becomes more difficult now for unions to have membership and to have dedicated membership, because they're no longer able to use the same type of fair share requirements that they have used in the past. So union membership has declined for a variety of reasons. The growth of high-tech industries has really moved us away from a manufacturing basis, and most of our unionization was unionized around and organized around manufacturing and factories. We've had geographic shifts as well, and so we've had people moving to states that are not as union friendly as the states they are coming from, because they're moving away from those industrial jobs, moving more towards service-based jobs in a lot of Sunbelt states, and moving away from the Rust Belt states where the unions used to have their primary basis of strength. You have changing in the workforce dynamic. You have a more educated workforce. You have more professional workforce. You have more white-collar workers as compared to blue-collar workers. White-collar workers are usually less likely to be unionized than their blue-collar counterparts. The way in which striking workers have been managed and the replacement of striking workers. Back in the early part of the Reagan administration, we had the air traffic controller strike. And so the air traffic controller said that they were going on strike until they got a new contract. President Reagan said, this is a public safety position, and so therefore, if you go on strike, I will fire all the air traffic controllers who go on strike. They didn't believe him. They went on strike, and the Reagan administration fired those air traffic controllers. The air traffic controllers then took a grievance to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration, saying that is a public safety job. And so therefore he was in his right to get rid of these air traffic controllers and replace them with new air traffic controllers, because it was a matter of public safety. That kind of had a really a cold water effect, if you will, on the strength of unions. And so I think that's another reason why we've seen some decline in union membership. Unions tend to organize the least needy industries versus the most needy industries. Misplaced focus on bargaining and grievance versus organizing. Unions have put a lot of their emphasis on collective bargaining and filing grievances, as opposed to cultivating membership and organizing membership. And again, that's been complicated now with the results of the Janus case. And there are always those persistent tales of union corruption, in that union leaders are making money off of the unionization process. And that always creates a negative taste, if you will, in the mouths of people when they look at unions. Unions really grew a lot in the 1960s and the 1970s, but that growth was primarily at the state and the local level, as opposed to a growth in federal unions. And one of the reasons for that is that the scope of bargaining, the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over at the federal level, that's a much more limited scope than what we see at the state and the local level. And that's especially in terms of the number one issue, which is compensation. Technically, federal employee unions cannot negotiate over compensation. The reason they cannot negotiate over compensation is because compensation is established by Congress. And so by allowing them to negotiate over compensation, you are taking that control away from Congress, and you cannot do that because that's one of Congress's powers and responsibilities. So because of congressional control over compensation, it makes it kind of difficult to negotiate over compensation. Congress, there's a compensation committee. One of my former colleagues from BYU for many years, he was appointed by President Obama to the Compensation Commission. And as a compensation commissioner, he would travel to DC a couple of times per year, and they would meet and make recommendations about potential compensation increases for the federal workforce, make those recommendations then to Congress. So Congress controls federal compensation. We also have to remember that labor laws are going to differ between the federal level and state and local levels. And a lot of that difference has to do with the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over and the right to stop, the right to work stoppages. And so what you can collectively bargain over at the federal level will oftentimes be different than what you can collectively bargain over here in California versus what you can bargain over in Florida versus what you can bargain over in Wisconsin, for example. The collective bargaining process consists of an organization to bargain. So you get organized to bargain, you bargain, and then it results in a new contract, a new collective bargaining agreement that then gets implemented and administered. Some of the legal factors that affect representation and collective bargaining, the relationship between parties, union security provisions, meaning that the provisions that secure the right of the unions to exist and the right of employees who join those unions. That's what's considered to be a union security type of provision. Administrative arrangements that have been developed between the management and between employees. ULPs, otherwise known as unfair labor practices. So if one party in the collective bargaining process feels that the other party is not negotiating in good faith, they can take an unfair labor practice claim to, at the federal level, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. At the state level, they would take it to the Public Employee Relations Board, otherwise known as PERB. They can file an unfair labor practice claim with that governing body, and then the governing body will investigate and determine whether or not both parties are negotiating in good faith. One example of not negotiating in good faith is to do bargaining in which you put forth a proposal and then your next proposal is not as good as the proposal that you put forth. So you put forth a 3% salary increase, and then the union comes back with a 5% salary increase. And then your response is, well, we're going to reduce it to a 2% offer. That would not be considered to be negotiations in good faith. And that could be considered to be unfair. If the management tries to shut down the union or make it difficult for people to join the union, that could also be considered to be an unfair labor practice. Impasse procedures, what happens if we cannot come to an agreement and come up with a collective bargaining agreement? We then run into an impasse. And so the types of impasse procedures that are allowed will differ between states. And state law will, in some states, will allow fact-finding and mediation and arbitration. Some will only allow fact-finding. Some will only allow binding arbitration. Some do not allow binding arbitration. So there are a lot of legal differences, not just between the federal government and state governments, but between state collective bargaining processes as well. So how does the process work? How do you organize the bargain? Well, the initial steps in the process are identifying the appropriate bargaining unit. And so members within a part of the organization or in a certain occupation will then organize themselves into a bargaining unit. That bargaining unit is then recognized by a regulatory body. At the federal level, it's the Federal Labor Relations Authority. At the state level, it's the Public Employee Relations Board. And here in California, we have what we call CalPERB. And CalPERB will establish criteria for what constitutes a bargaining unit and what the composition of that bargaining unit must look like. Once that bargaining unit feels it meets those criteria, it can then hold an election to decide to become a bargaining unit. And then if a majority want to join a bargaining unit, become a bargaining unit, you then have certification of the bargaining unit and certification of the bargaining agent. The bargaining agent will then lead the collective bargaining process for that bargaining unit. You then have a selection of a bargaining team, the individuals who will participate on behalf of that bargaining unit in the collective bargaining process. Once that is all established, you then engage in the collective bargaining process. Again, the collective bargaining process, the assumption is that both sides are going to negotiate in good faith. The scope of negotiations must be prescribed, and usually that's going to be prescribed by state law. And by scope of bargaining, we mean the types of issues that can be discussed. There are mandatory issues that must be discussed in collective bargaining. There are permissive issues that can be discussed if both sides agree to discuss those issues. And then there are prohibited issues, issues that may not be discussed in the collective bargaining process. Again, at the federal level, compensation is typically in that category of a prohibited issue for collective bargaining. At the state level, for public safety positions, work stoppages and striking, that is oftentimes within the prohibited issues of discussion. You're not allowed to engage in that type of work stoppage if you are in what is termed to be a public safety type of position. Hopefully you'll engage in principled bargaining, which will be issue-based, cooperative type of bargaining, where you stress the common ground and things that you can agree upon, things that are in the benefit of both the bargaining unit as well as administration. Sometimes in the collective bargaining process, unions will be asked to engage in concession bargaining, where they'll be asked to give something up. And one example of concession bargaining is what's called productivity bargaining. And so economic pressures could require unions to demand greater productivity from their workforce or greater efficiency from the workforce in order to protect them against layoffs, reductions in force, or changes in compensation. So to protect their compensation level, to protect their employees, they will then engage in productivity bargaining, where they will agree to acquire more contributions and higher levels of productivity from their union membership to avoid layoffs and to avoid cuts in wages and compensation. Typically, this collective bargaining agreement, when it is agreed upon, then becomes affirmed as a written document, and we usually have a written collective bargaining agreement. Collective bargaining agreements are usually broken up according to articles, and kind of look a little bit like a constitution. Each article will deal with a different issue. So there'll be an article that deals with union rights. There'll be an article that deals with work conditions. There'll be an article that deals with performance appraisal. There may be an article that deals with disciplining and sanctioning. There could be an article that deals with future organizations for that union and way in which that union can organize in the future. All those different compensation, all those different things will be found in different articles within that collective bargaining agreement. And then that collective bargaining agreement then overlays on top of the career civil service protections that career civil servants have. And so when you're working as a leader or manager in a public organization, whereby you're dealing with career civil servants, but you're also dealing with unionized employees, you have to remember that that collective bargaining agreement is something you have to know and you have to abide by and endeavor not to violate in the way in which you are managing those unionized employees. But what happens if through the collective bargaining process it breaks down and we are not able to get a collective bargaining agreement? Well, that's referred to as an impasse in negotiations. And there are ways in which you can deal with those types of impasse. Some first resort options are things like mediation and fact-finding. The federal government has a federal mediation and conciliation service, and they have trained mediators that they will send out to try and mediate between the union and between management to help them come to an agreement on that CBA. Fact-finding is another approach to resolving an impasse, whereby a neutral fact-finder will come in, will then conduct research looking at how the negotiations have transpired. We'll look at the offers that have been given by the union, the offers that are given by management, and we'll then create a fact-finding report. That fact-finding report is usually non-binding. It will be embargoed for usually the first couple of weeks, so that it's only available to the bargaining unit and to management. By embargoing it and make sure it's only available to the parties who are involved in the negotiation process, You allow those parties to review the fact-finding report, and then hopefully that will help them come to a negotiated settlement. Once that fact-finding report is released after that 2-week embargo period, then everyone has a chance to read it. And sometimes that fact-finding report will be written to in the favor of one party versus the other. So if the fact-finding report is written in favor of the union and it makes management look very bad, chances are that will then place an imperative on management to try and get a negotiated settlement before the embargo period ends and everyone gets to read this fact-finding report. So in essence, it's just kind of placing pressure on one party or the other to come to a negotiated settlement. If none of that works, some of your last resort options include arbitration. Sometimes we have grievance arbitration, where if the union files a grievance, an arbiter will then come in and decide if that grievance is valid and what types of structural remedies should be provided to remedy that grievance. Grievances oftentimes here in California will end up going to CalPERB, and then CalPERB will have to decide which party is in the right in terms of that grievance. Binding arbitration is when an arbiter comes in and will then come to a conclusion and will basically look at the proposals from the union, the proposals from management, and will then offer up a solution. And that solution is then binding on both parties. And that final solution that comes from that arbiter then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. A variation on that is what's called final offer arbitration. The arbiter will come in, will look at the last offer from union, the last offer from management, will pick either the union or management offer, and then both parties are bound by that decision made by that arbiter. Once you have that collective bargaining agreement, however you have gotten there, you then must administer the contract. And the union steward and first line supervisor are usually the key players in administering and implementing that contract. There'll be grievance procedures in place so that if the union feels that management is violating an aspect of that contract, they can then file a grievance. They can then meet with management to try and deal with that grievance. If that grievance is not resolved between management and the union, then that grievance can go to CalPERB at the state level or the FLRA at the federal level, depending upon if you're talking about a state or a federal type of agency. Collective bargaining is difficult. These negotiations are very difficult because even though we try to avoid the adversarial relationship, at the very heart, it is still an adversarial relationship. Unions looking out for the benefit and the welfare of their members. The management is oftentimes looking out for the welfare of the organization. So some handy tips to try and assist coming up with positive solutions and coming up with collective bargaining agreements: being willing to share power to solve problems, being patient and acknowledging mistakes that are made, investing the requisite time and effort to build relationships, to resolve differences, and cooperating where the interests of both parties converge. In my district, we had a situation where we put together what was called a labor management initiative, or an LMI. And that labor management initiative consisted of a variety of team building types of meetings between the bargaining unit, the leadership, the bargaining team, between administration of the district, members of the school board, and they would engage in these team building activities to get to know each other and to build this good rapport, this good working relationship that would then translate into the negotiation table during the collective bargaining process. And a lot of organizations have started implementing those types of labor management initiatives. Things to avoid, to try to accomplish a positive solution in collective bargaining agreement. If you're unwilling to fix the deteriorating relationship, so if you're having a bad relationship between the bargaining team and between management, and you're not willing to acknowledge and try and fix that relationship, it's just going to self-perpetuate and get worse. Failing to recognize the inevitability of conflict. At its very heart, it is an adversarial relationship. No matter how much we try to cooperate, there will be conflict over issues. You're not always going to have a situation where the goals of the union will be the same as the goals of the organization. And in fact, most of the time, the goals will not converge. When you're inattentive to cultivating a harmonious work atmosphere, so if you don't have these things like labor management initiatives, you don't develop this relationship and trust and rapport, and providing tardy and unfair response to complaints. So if the union does have some complaints about how management is doing negotiations, if management ignores those complaints, They will then build into a grievance. They may build into an unfair labor practice claim. And then once they get into an unfair labor practice claim and they make their way up to the state level to CalPERM, that is then going to have a very chilling effect upon the relationship between the bargaining team and between management. But collective bargaining is a reality in the public sector. We still have some relatively high levels of unionization in the public sector. And so collective bargaining is something that is really going to determine what that collective bargaining agreement says, and the collective bargaining agreement will then dictate how the union and how the management interact with each other. So I hope this has been helpful discussion of unions and collective bargaining. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will also then provide a week 7 assignment video to give you some background on some of the assignments you'll be doing this week. Take care.